Join me, the arm historian, for an in-depth journey into the heart of modern arm wrestling as we uncover the intriguing story behind one of its most debated techniques, the King's Move. In this episode, we'll unveil the origins, pioneers, and eventual masters of this move, and dive into the controversies that have, at times, seemingly divided the entire community. Although the King's Move is often portrayed as a recent and modern addition to arm wrestling, its true origins go back quite a way. The outside move, sometimes likened to an open top roll, is typified by an athlete's open and low stance and relies heavily on pronation and, depending on who you ask, skeletal structure of the arm. This makes anyone proficient in the King's Move notoriously hard to pin. Formerly often referred to as a bone lock, it seems one of its earliest adopters, or perhaps one of the first people to actually get proficient in the move, is a man named George Izakowicz. The Romanian-born Canadian George, also known in the arm wrestling scene as Crazy George, is often credited online as the inventor of the King's Move. But was George truly the first man ever to utilize this style of arm wrestling? In my opinion, it's likely there were other pullers who might have used similar techniques in and perhaps before the same time George Izakowicz first started using it. One of them being the Russian Anatoly Mairanzev. Anatoly was apparently King's moving as early as 1996 when he competed in the WAF Worlds of that year, held in Virginia Beach. However, regardless of who first used our titular technique, it's clear George and Anatoly were still pioneers of what would become known as the King's Move in a competitive setting. George would go on to rise to the top of his weight class in the sport, competing at some of the highest profile tournaments of the time, while relying on his ever-developing King's Move. However, as the move gained notoriety, fellow arm wrestlers were starting to speculate on not only its validity within the rules, but also how George and others like him were able to pull off such a technique with seeming ease. Some would speculate the move could only be performed by very seasoned arm wrestlers who had developed a significant deformation in their elbows, resulting in a decreased range of motion. In other words, arm wrestlers who could no longer straighten their arms completely and so relied more on skeletal integrity. This school of thought would lead the move to become known originally as a bone lock and caused an almost sort of mythos to develop around the arms of athletes like George and whether or not they could actually straighten out. Another one of these athletes, but perhaps a little less well known in certain circles, is the French Joszef Lovei. This kickboxer turned arm wrestler and now nearly 30-year veteran of the sport made a name for himself by doing very well on the tournament scene and being an entertaining and energetic character at his super match appearances. He featured in Arm Wars as well as the WAL, and while not exclusively using a King's Move, he was known to pull it out when deemed necessary. At least equally as impressive is the Swiss Pascal Girard. With more than 30 years in the sport, Pascal has risen to the highest echelons of the sport and is by all accounts a very crafty tournament puller. Girard is known as an experienced King's mover and doesn't shy away from using his own version of it. However, one person stands out in modern arm wrestling as a notorious King's mover. Michael Todd, drawing perhaps the most scrutiny on his use of the King's Move, especially when allowed more freedom in certain leagues, gained immense success in his arm wrestling career by utilizing the move to great effect in the super heavyweight competition. His use of the move coincided with a serious boost in popularity of arm wrestling, especially in the online world. Throngs of people were introduced to arm wrestling and later Michael Todd, causing more attention on the King's Move than perhaps ever before. Public opinion, therefore, quickly became equally as divisive on the move as the opinions of veteran arm wrestlers, which would eventually, by some, develop into the King's Move being hailed as not real arm wrestling and cheating. This in turn led to a reinvigorated debate at large about the by now controversial move, and in some cases even slight revisions to certain leagues' rules to somewhat combat the most egregious examples of the move. One of the many discussions about the King's Move, this one being held around 2016 on Facebook, included a lot of big names in the community. Devon Larratt, who had himself utilized the move on several occasions and who had become a supporter of its legitimacy, was one of them. Another one of the people present in the discussion was Engin Terzi, who seemingly had developed a substantial disdain for the move, having faced it many times before in tournaments. Engin's unbridled hate for the move would continue to be a talking point for him sporadically throughout his career, even up until the present day, dubbing it the desperation move. In the aforementioned online and quite public discussion, Derek Smith, a now accomplished North American arm wrestler, gave his 2 cents on the move. Derek held to believe that only a true veteran of the sport, someone whose arm had been shaped by countless hours of arm wrestling and arm wrestling related training, could perform the move effectively. Because of this, he went on to suggest the move should be called the King's Move, as only the kings of arm wrestling could truly use it in an effective way. Devin Larratt read Derek's message and latched on to the name, helping to spread it way beyond this one Facebook conversation. The debates raged on during the following years, with major figures in the arm wrestling world like Engin Terzi and Bob Brown continuing to discredit the King's Move, while people like Devin Larratt and Michael Todd were quick to defend the technique they had both come to use competitively. On a personal note, I believe that whatever stays within the confines of the rules should be allowed during competitions. If a certain move is only possible because of a technicality or oversight, but is still deemed as a detriment to the sport as a whole, it should not be banned, but instead the conversation should be directed toward changing the rule set itself. Since arm wrestling is still a relatively young, organized sport, it makes some amount of sense that several aspects or rules aren't as clear-cut as we'd like them to be. This should, however, not stop us, but rather encourage us in having open and transparent discussions about them and the rules that help make our sport what it is. An argument that is often repeated is that the King's Move leads to aesthetically ugly matches, especially for spectators new to the sport, who don't yet grasp the full intricacies happening on the table. One infamous match that is often cited for its ugliness is one between Dave Chafee and Devin Larratt during the 2019 WAL 504 Super Showdown in Los Angeles. While yes, this doesn't look that great, it does serve as an interesting case study in what happens when a relatively open rule set sees 2 super heavyweight competitors putting everything on the line. The issue on whether or not the King's Move actually requires a bone lock, and by extension an arm that doesn't fully straighten, is still one under heavy debate in modern-day competitive arm wrestling. Some argue this has nothing to do with the move, while others say it isn't a true King's Move until a bone lock is achieved. While it certainly appears to be true that a lot of people who use the technique can no longer straighten their arms, this might be a consequence of the move requiring a large amount of experience and practice to master, and thus mainly being used by people whose arms have already deformed by years of arm wrestling. In essence, it boils down to a chicken and egg situation, where people who have bone-locked arms might feel more comfortable using a King's Move, or the state of their arm is a direct consequence of the practice needed to learn the King's Move fully. Either way, whether you feel like a true King's Move needs a bone lock, or on the other side of the coin you think it requires mostly, or maybe exclusively skill, I believe one thing holds irrefutably true. The King's Move is inevitable. What I mean by that is that its emergence was probably due to a natural progression and evolution of the top roll, in an environment where some athletes would look for the edges of the rules. In other words, how open and how far back can I take my outside movement and hopefully not fall out? In my opinion, a King's Move might sometimes rely on a bone lock, but in order to take full advantage, it is at the end of the day a teachable and sometimes highly effective move that, despite its controversial status within the arm wrestling community, is in my opinion here to stay. Let me know your thoughts on the King's Move in the comments, and until next time, Arm Historian out.